Hey everybody, thanks so much for getting up so early and abandoning all your responsibilities on this beautiful morning. I'd like to start with a little disclaimer. Some of the pictures that I will show have some violence and partial nudity, in case anybody would like to be forewarned. And I'm going to speak really quickly to our theme today, which is commitment. For most people, I think commitment is an admirable trait. For me, the word seems more like a euphemism for being too stubborn or stupid to quit when all signs point to that's what I should do. But I'm going to begin kind of where photography started for me, which was really early on, around age 9 or 10. This is my grandmother, Ruth Martin. So about that time, 9 or 10, she was struggling with Alzheimer's disease, and my grandfather took me on a road trip and handed me a camera, and something happened on that trip where I made a picture that was really pretty banal and boring, but when I saw it afterwards, it transported me back to the feeling that I had in that place with my grandfather. And so that set me on this path, creating photographs of primarily family, and then a lot of bad nature pictures as well. But recently, my grandfather passed away last year, and I inherited his photo archive, and I've been going through finding these pictures of my grandmother and my grandfather, and even some pictures of me and my siblings as young kids, and realizing what a gift it is just to be able to look through this kind of visual history of our family and put the pieces together. So these first photographs are of her. Obviously, this is my grandmother very young. Probably, I believe this was her wedding day or leading up to it. This is on the wedding day, years later. And this is kind of in her final time as she's struggling with Alzheimer's disease. Here's an example of one of my bad flower pictures. This is to say we all have to start somewhere. So my parents were incredibly supportive. When I geeked out on photography really hard between ages 10 and 12, I was shooting tons of slide film, mostly photographing kind of nature around our home, but also photographing my siblings and my parents without putting much thought into it. These are two of my sisters and one of their friends. I played a lot of music in high school and felt like I had to make a choice as I was nearing college, and it was either I'm going to be shredding in metal bands and biker bars, or I'm going to be making pictures. And I had to kind of weigh out what felt like the most potential for social use. And I ended up with photography. So I went to study photojournalism at Ohio University, and I started there in 2004. Ohio University is in Athens, Ohio, which is in the southeastern corner of the state. It's a pretty rural, isolated place. And I pretty quickly burned out on the college bubble of just hanging out on Court Street and getting to know college students, and I became really curious about what was happening on the outskirts of this college community. So what I'm going to begin showing you all now, I've kind of broken this presentation into two parts. The first is the Invisible Yoke, which, as you see, I put an end date on, but this work spans from 2005 until hopefully its completion in 2020. And then the second body of work I'll be showing you all is some more recent photographs of my family. So this series starts with Carry Me, Ohio, which was released in 2016 as a book. And it looks at these rural communities in southeastern Ohio that used to rely on coal, salt, clay, timber, other extractive industries to sustain them. Most of these industries pulled out in the late 50s, and so these communities that I've been documenting most of the kids growing up there now never saw the prosperity that they were always told about. And the way that I tend to work is I find somebody that seems open, and then I latch on to them, and I go back again and again and again. So this is Jesse Jr. after winning a dirt bike race. This is in the kitchen of his family's home. And I met his father at a car wash when they were washing the dirt bikes, and he said, "Hey, well, why don't you jump in the back of the truck and I'll introduce you to the family." Not really thinking things through, I jumped in the back of the truck and I went back and met the family. That could have ended poorly, but I kind of fell in love with this family, and I've been photographing them for over 10 years now. So this is Jesse at age 7. He's now in the Marine Corps, and he's stationed in Japan. This is one of his sisters. So I was really drawn in by their openness and vulnerability with me, but also just because I was really curious about his sisters, Casey and Lacey, who are identical twins that were born deaf. And I was curious about how they were going to chart a future in this really difficult place for anybody, but especially if you aren't able to hear. So they became kind of primary characters throughout this narrative that expanded over a 10-year period of time. So one person will typically kind of lead me to another person and another. So eventually, I had a class assignment to photograph somebody with a tattoo. I knew Jesse Sellers, the father of the twins, had some tattoos, so I asked if I could photograph him. He said, well, let's do one better. I want to go get some new ink. Can you drive me? I said, all right, sure. Where are we going to go? Thinking tattoo parlor somewhere in town. He's like, we're going to go out to Carbondale, which is the middle of the woods. And we ended up in this log cabin with this guy, Clayton, who's an ex-con that learned how to shoot ink in prison, and he was doing prison-style tattoos out of the living room. So through Jesse, I met Clayton, and then kind of continued to expand my network of people that I photographed. This is in a trailer in Chauncey, Ohio on Super Bowl Sunday. These boys are smoking out of a homemade bong. This is the Sellers dog, Hercules, out the kitchen window on a snow day. These are medicine bottles in the windowsill. This photograph's called Tyler Holding His Father's Ashes. So in that cabin in Carbondale, I also met Tyler Woodrum, who was 15, I think, at the time, 16 when I met him. And after a few visits, I kept noticing this strange box that was by a mattress on the floor with this rooster on top. And I asked Tyler, I said, hey, man, what's up with that box? Can you tell me the story behind that? And he's like, oh, that's my dad. I said, wait, what? Can you, let's back up here a little bit. He said, well, my dad was killed in a four-wheeling accident, so we had his body cremated and put in that box, and his favorite cockfighting rooster was stuffed and mounted on top. So I made this portrait of Tyler holding his father's ashes. This is Elvis the zebra. He lives at a place called the Wilds, which is a reclaimed strip mine that they turned into a conservation and research facility. So if you go to southeastern Ohio, this is in Cumberland, during the summer months, you can take a safari and see animals that don't actually belong in Ohio wandering the hills. This is back in Chauncey in the trailer. This is Johnny shortly after being released from prison, where he got this tattoo. So now I'm jumping to another chapter in this series. This is called Sin and Salvation in Baptist-Town. This series is due out later this fall in book form. In early 2010, I was sent to Greenwood, Mississippi on an assignment, and similar to the way that I met folks in Ohio, whenever somebody comes up to me and says, hey, let me tell you my story, once you come into my home, all of my photographer antennae jump up. And for some reason, just in the first day that I was there, people were coming out of their homes saying, hey, clearly you don't belong here. Let me tell you about my story. Come into my kitchen. Come into my bedroom. And when I encounter that sort of openness and vulnerability, I'm all in. So after the assignment completed, I kept going back on my own, funding out of my own pocket, and then rolling that into some small grants that kept me going back over a course of 7 years. I've spent about 120, 130 days in Greenwood. Most of these photographs were made in the Baptist-Town neighborhood, which is where The Help lived in the 50s, 60s. And if any of y'all saw the movie The Help, portions of it were filmed in the Baptist-Town neighborhood because it still looks like 1950s, 1960s America. This is Quan waking up in his aunt's bed. So over the years that I've been photographing there, there's been a number of members of the community that have just opened their doors to me. So this is in my friend Ellen's home, and it's kind of my safe place when I go there. Whenever I'm dehydrated or just tired of wandering around looking for photographs, I can go to her place and just knock on the door and let myself in. Shortly after I started this project, one of the boys that I knew from the corner named Butto was murdered. He was 18. He was the third person in his family to be killed. So violence is definitely part of the community here, but it does not define it. And being brought into this kind of scene of mourning was something that really shaped and transformed my perception of the place. The shadow on the wall is my buddy Winky. He was one of the first people that I met in Baptistown. He was sitting on the corner with a few of his buddies, and I wandered up to them, clearly not being from around there, and asked if I could hang out and make some pictures. They said, yeah, sure, whatever. And it took me 10 or 15 minutes to realize they were selling drugs the whole time that I was there, and they just did not care because I was on their turf, and it was their rules, and they didn't feel threatened by me. So I've gotten to know Winky pretty well over the years. When I met him, he had one little girl who was about the same age as my oldest daughter, and now he has 6 children between 2 different relationships. And so whenever I go back, I'm kind of trying to reconnect with these main characters in the story. This is Fat Man taking his first steps. This is on Ellen's front porch. This is the morning after Butta's wake. This is on the corner of Young and Pelican Streets where the young men will hang out. So now we're jumping into the 3rd chapter of this series. This is called The 7 Cities, which documents the Hampton Roads region of Virginia where I grew up and where I raised my children for 6 years. So this was the first time that I started a body of work without a specific publication in mind. And I partnered up with the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art to create this multi-year project that we displayed at MoCA and then at 7 different satellite venues around Hampton Roads. The nice thing about photographing for myself is that I don't have to think about what an editor wants or expects. So this was from a senior Olympic event where I went with the intent of photographing very athletic older folks, and I was really just drawn into this strange kind of quirky guy's body language, and so I was just obsessed with him. He was the guy giving out medals to all the old folks. This is a fire hose baptism in Newport News. This is my wife and daughter at home. My father in the James River. This is a picture I like to stop on because it kind of represents an experiment and a little bit of a thought shift for me. So most of what I do professionally is working for publications that send me into communities and people's lives that I'm not really a part of, and I have to own my outsider status but still achieve some level of intimacy in a really short period of time. The woman in this picture is my friend Amanda Lucier, who's also a photojournalist. She was working for the Virginian Pilot, and we lived across the fence from one another in Norfolk, and we would host photo nights and little gatherings, but more frequently we would get together and she would kind of complain to me about the boring newspaper assignments that she was having to do, and I would complain about the fact that I didn't know where my next paycheck was coming from, but we would kind of support and encourage one another through the ups and downs. And while I was working on this project, she was in a relationship with this guy, Josh, who's a Riverine, and I knew that they were going to this fancy military ball, so I asked if I could make a portrait of them. She said, well, what if we did one better than that? Like, what if I gave you the access that we always dream of as photographers, just to say, the door is open, you come in and photograph what you want. So she told me a time to arrive. I showed up and let myself in. I'd been into her house numerous times before. I knew Josh, but I didn't really know how uncomfortable it was going to be to let myself into a friend's home and like have to creep into the back bedroom looking for them. They were asleep together in bed. And so I photographed them waking up and getting ready. And this was one of the last pictures that I made as they were departing. And there's a sort of tension visible in the body language in the photograph, even though relationally everything was fine at that point. It almost felt prophetic for something that came later. After he deployed, he came back with PTSD and the relationship fell apart. But to complete the experiment, we left our side door open one day, and Amanda came in early in the morning and photographed me in bed with my wife and daughter while our older daughter was up watching cartoons. And then we brought our pictures together and we compared notes and discussed what it meant to be vulnerable in front of the camera and behind the camera, and how it's really important, at least for the kind of work that we do, to remember what it feels like and what we ask of people when we go out to make photographs, because it's a lot that we ask. So the fun part of this project was just wandering all over the community, going to fairs and political gatherings and birthday parties and even some funerals, but just catching as much of life as I could, trying to soak in a wide array of experience. This was another example of a situation that I went to looking for one thing but found something else. This was on a basketball court behind a civic center where there was a rap competition. So I went to photograph the rap competition and then was disappointed with the results. Went to the bathroom and looked out the back window and saw all these little dudes running around shirtless playing basketball. I thought, that's where the picture is. So now jumping to chapter 4. This last chapter is supposed to be released right before the next presidential elections. And this chapter is called We the Free. And unlike the other projects that are kind of geographically based, this one I literally am wandering all over America. So I'm drawing these pictures from different assignments and personal travels and kind of explorations over the years. This is Halloween on Tangier Island. This is outside of the New York Times building. This is from the Unite the Right rally in town last August. This is hanging out with some alligator hunters in Louisiana. So for a long time I've sensed this growing discontent in America. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's seen it or felt it. But wherever I go, whoever I talk to, it's bubbling to the surface. This is a preacher watering the grass outside of his church in Bristol, Tennessee. This is an example of I got sent by ESPN to photograph a football game, and I'm bringing back pictures of sweaty preachers watering the grass. You know. I can't help who I'm drawn to. So a lot of these pictures, there's some sort of relationship that I've tried to build with the people. Sometimes it's a very fleeting connection. Sometimes it's something that I can return to time and time again. This was after August 12th. I was actually standing across the street with a reporter about to call it a night, and then saw these little puffs of smoke appearing around the Lee statue, and I thought somebody was setting a fire at first, and then wandered over to find this man throwing holy powder at Lee's statue until the cops chased him away. This is in Richmond. It's for a piece about evictions for the New York Times. Here we are in Ferguson, Missouri. This is my grandfather and his girlfriend, Anne. He's, I want to say 94 in this photograph, and I apologize, the calibration on the screen's a bit off. The picture is not that green. So I desperately wanted to photograph their relationship. So after my grandmother passed away, my grandfather and Anne started a relationship, and they stayed together for the remainder of his life. They never cohabitated, they never shared a bank account, but they spent a lot of time together, and Anne was very camera shy and kind of worried about what her girlfriends would think. So she put the kibosh on me doing much of a story, but at least I made this picture. This is something that I will always have. And whenever I trace my relationship with photography back to its root, it starts with him. Stacy requested that I put this photograph in the slideshow. This is a very new picture. This is my youngest. I have my wife to thank for this photograph. She called me while she was driving to work one morning. She said, "Hey, I just drove past something kind of strange on 29. You might want to put on pants and go see what's happening." So managed to track these guys down. They were being punished by their drill instructor for mouthing off. They got lots of honks from the trucker crowd. This is the Sweetwater Rattlesnake Roundup in Texas. These folks do this every year. They set up a casket with a fake body in it, and they wait for a car to pass, and then this guy will jump into the casket to replace the fake body while wearing this mask, and then he jumps out to scare people. So that's where a lot of my creative energy's been for the last 10, 12 years, is working on the Invisible Yoke series, which is kind of traditional documentary, photojournalism sort of work, in that I'm not controlling much of anything other than portraits. Everything else is as it happened. And recently I completed an MFA in photography at the University of Hartford, and while I was in that program, I decided to try and shift my working methods a little bit and the way that I was photographing my family in particular. As I mentioned, I've been photographing families since I was a kid, but it's always been in this kind of snapshot aesthetic. And so with this series, which I will have to kind of power through to keep on time, I slowed my methods down a bit, started photographing with black and white film, and creating these sort of staged narratives based around kind of feelings that I had about family and the experiences that we shared. During this time, we moved from Norfolk to Charlottesville, and my siblings all kind of had dramatic things happening in their lives. My parents separated, and my grandfather passed away. So all of those kind of layers of family experience are built into this work. This was a picture I uncovered of my grandmother in a chest in my grandfather's bedroom on the day of his funeral. So these pictures are a lot more personal for me, obviously, just because it is my family. But what I'm hoping to make with these photographs is something that's not just about my experience, but something that might be a little bit more universally accessible to viewership, so that somebody could look into it and find some piece of their own experience. This one is one of the many fish casualties in our household. When my daughter was 7, my dad showed up at the house one day with a bait of fish, and he said, "Hey, this is so you can teach your kid about death." This is my parents in our backyard on my sister's birthday. This is my parents when they put their dog to sleep. So there's a couple copies of this book on the table out there if y'all wish to see this whole collection of pictures. Carry Me, Ohio is also on the table out there, and some postcards. There's an upcoming exhibition of Sin and Salvation in Baptisttown at George Washington University in D.C. this July. There's some postcards for that. If anybody's up in D.C., I would love to see you there. And I think there's a little bit of time for Q&A. If y'all have any questions, I would love to chat.
Thanks, Matt. Let's give Matt a round of applause before we do Q&A. So we do have time for a few questions. We ask that you commit to projecting when you ask your question, just so Matt can hear you. Cameron.
Grandfather and his girlfriend are not having permission to take that on that story. What about when you were dealing with the other people, getting permission for that? And did they look at the photographs before you published them?
So it depends on the situation. In an assignment, I'm technically not allowed to show photographs to the people in the images. That's kind of the contractual agreement. But with personal projects, I'm always bringing prints back to folks so that they see how I see them, because I think that's really important. Oftentimes what I see is a projection, and it may not be the way that they want to be represented. So there's oftentimes some conversation about that. So with the Mississippi work in particular, I brought a book maquette. So as I'm kind of going through the process of making these projects, I try putting them together in different forms to see what works. And I brought the book dummy to show to Winky, and he was like, "Cool, thanks." And he took it and then bailed, and I was like, "Oh no, where's the book going?" He wandered all around the neighborhood, showed it to a variety of folks, and then came back and gave me their feedback, which was terrifying. And it was basically, some of the older folks don't like the guns and drugs that appear in the book. It's like, oh, okay, well it's part of the community. I don't want to lie by leaving it out, but I also don't want to just reinforce negative stereotypes either. So these conversations are really important to shaping the way that the work ends up.
Matt, you have these long relationships with, like Winky and people in Baptist Town, and obviously your own family. But there are, kind of in the We the Free body of work, it seems to be more fleeting, more a street photography approach. Do you ever contact those people and try to build relationships, and do you reach a dead end, or are those just fleeting people? And talk about the difference in the photos. I mean, is one better or worse, or are they just two different kinds of work?
It's a great question. And this is Pat Jarrett. Pat's a photographer around here who has assisted me on a number of jobs. So I owe him lots of money. he's here just to remind me of that fact, actually. I've gone back and forth on that too. So one way of working is a lot more emotionally taxing for me. So these long-term relationships with folks can be really draining, and they require a lot of attention and effort over time. And sometimes, as an artist, I just want to go out and make and not have to unpack our entire complicated American legacy with every person that becomes, part of a photograph. So a lot of those pictures, it's the We the Free chapter in particular is kind of an opening up of my process and the way that I work and the way that I see, and a lot of the interactions are more fleeting. Some of the people in those pictures I have maintained long relationships with, and some, I still haven't met that I'm hoping will lead me to other things. But that body of work, I think, will be a little less personal, which I believe also kind of reflects what I want to say with that chapter of the work. Just looking at the polarized politics and the way that the country's becoming more and more divided.
At the very beginning, you talked about making a choice between metal and photography. And you sort of said that you left metal behind when you committed to photography, but you probably didn't really leave it behind. So what about the metal is translating into your work now? Or has it over the...
That's a wonderful question. So it's funny, when I was in a metal band, I was listening to lots of non-metal music. I went through a Sarah McLachlan kick, I'm kind of ashamed to admit, those sorts of things. So I listen to a wide variety of music now, and it all filters into the work. Every time I'm sequencing a set of photographs, there's something playing in the background. The last few days, it's been This Is America on repeat. Sometimes it's Rachel's or Zoe Keating. There's just a wide variety of music that kind of percolates with these pictures. And sometimes I've put together book maquettes and gotten feedback on them. One of my professors looked at one of my maquettes and said that it sounded like a punk rock album to him, just like it was banging the cymbals over and over again because the pictures were big and kind of brash. So I definitely always am thinking about that. I haven't been playing music at all, which feels like a missing part of me on a certain level. I miss that, but I also know that I couldn't invest the amount of time and energy in both mediums to hit the level that I wanted to creatively. But I'm fascinated with collaboration. So I've got a musician friend in LA that has come on some of these projects with me, and he'll record ambient sound or do original scores and things like that. So I always want music to be a part of what I'm making. It's just not something that I felt like I've been able to fully invest myself in since those high school days.
How does it work when you talked about the We the Free and there was the Halloween image and you were saying you were on assignment. How does it work in terms of when you're on assignment, what do you own and what do you not? What can you use for another project and what sort of belongs to whoever sent you for?
So that varies client by client, but typically I will not take a job unless I own the copyright to the work afterwards. So I don't do work for hire unless somebody's paying me boatloads of money that would allow me to go do something that I really want to do. But the general agreement between editorial outlets and photographers is that they pay me to make pictures, I own the copyright, and they have the rights to publish those images. So with an image like that Halloween photograph, that's kind of an outtake from a magazine piece that's ongoing. I highly doubt that they will end up using that photograph, but it's certainly one that they could consider. And oftentimes I'm sent with this kind of prepackaged narrative, and then what I find on the ground is not exactly that. It's more complicated and more nuanced. And so part of my job is to translate that nuance back in photographs and also in conversation with the editor to be like, you wanted me to find this, but what I found was actually a little different. So maybe we need to reassess what we're saying with this work or with this story. But yeah, it could get tricky. And certainly, like, as a creative, I don't like going out and just fulfilling somebody's expectations, right? Like, that's spoon-feeding content to an audience. But that's really where a lot of editorial photography is today, and a lot of news outlets are just looking for stories that kind of fulfill your expectations instead of subverting them or challenging your notions of what America might be.
So I was thinking about a little bit this decision to pursue photography instead of metal, and the one thing that you mentioned was the linchpin for that decision was the social implication. I forget how you put it, but social was the word I remember. Utility? Is that it? Social utility. I'm wondering, how actually would you explain the social utility of your photography? And related to that, what are your non-negotiables? I think I can make assumptions about some of that seeing your work, but I don't know, I'd probably be wrong.
Could you clarify a little bit what you mean by non-negotiables? Like when I'm accepting work or making work, or what?
I'm more interested in making work than accepting work, but you can answer both.
Okay. So my relationship with photography started really idealistic, as is often the case with folks. Like, I was exposed to photojournalism, and James Nachtwey was one of those like first photographers. I stumbled on a spread of his work from Iraq and American Photo in a bookstore when I took a lunch break in high school from the camera store that I worked at. And I thought, wow, this is A, it's incredible work, and B, this guy's willing to put his life on the line to tell what's going on in Iraq, and not from this kind of propagandistic, like, look at us coming to save everybody from Saddam sort of perspective, but more like, we're ruining these people's lives and this country because of our, national identity crisis or whatever. So that was kind of a starting point for me, and I wanted to make work that was going to have some social function, primarily raising awareness. And a lot of the early projects have to do with what it means to live in poverty in America today, and a lot of these kind of disenfranchised groups of people, whether in southeastern Ohio or in Mississippi, there's just parallels between the two. Even though they've got different skin color and they live in different sides of the country, it's like the same story, basically, just with different frameworks. But the longer I've done this, the more distrustful I've become of photography. I've become more distrustful of whether or not publishing with any major news outlet actually does any good, or if it just reinforces existing stereotypes. And so I'm constantly trying to interrogate that within my own practice and think of new ways that I can interact with the pictures and bring the pictures to the people that I'm photographing so they can interact with them. Because so often, at least in the world of photojournalism, it's you parachute into a place, you take, and then you leave, and there's very little engagement or discourse that happens with the people that you're photographing, and that's problematic for me. So I don't have a good solution to that, but it's something that I'm always trying to work around. And in terms of non-negotiables, I try and be really open when I go into these situations. I'm trying to meet people without judgment. I certainly carry my own biases with me, but then I try and leave them at the door and just meet people wherever they're at and listen. And oftentimes what I came there thinking is not what I walk away with. But I have to be really kind of open and able to adapt to the environment and to the stories that I'm hearing in those places.